All right, so today let's dive into this idea of strength. Strength in the desert. It's a theme that I think resonates with a lot of people, especially when we consider the sources you've brought in this time.
Yeah.
We've got excerpts from Bishop Dr. Loretta Sanders' book, Streams in the Desert, specifically from day 6. And we've paired those excerpts with an audio recording of one of her prayer sessions.
It's interesting having both the written and the spoken. It's like we get to see the message come alive in a different way.
Yeah, it's almost like we're there with them. And
Yeah.
the way she kicks it off, she starts with that story about the withered plant.
Right.
That really resonated with me.
It's such a powerful visual, isn't it?
Yeah.
Just picturing that plant, desperate for some water.
Yeah.
She talks about how the leaves were all curled in, just trying to hold on to any little bit of moisture.
It's almost instinctive, isn't it? That desire to protect ourselves, to pull inward. When we're feeling depleted like that plant, it's not just about feeling sad or tired. It's like our whole system goes into survival mode.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's like that fight or flight response kicking in. Bishop Sanders
Yeah.
calls these times our dry seasons. And it makes you think about your own life. When do you recognize that same feeling? When does stress have you ready to just curl up and disappear?
It's a good question. And what's interesting is she doesn't leave us with that image of depletion. She goes straight to Isaiah 40.2931.
Right.
Which, so many people know that verse. He gives strength to the weary.
Yes.
But to hear her weave it into this picture of a parched landscape, it just takes on a whole new meaning.
It does. And the way she emphasizes the word hope in that passage, it's not this passive wish. It's active. It's like the fuel for the strength we need to keep going.
It's that forward momentum. It's not about waiting for something to change. It's about finding that strength within to make the change, to soar on wings like eagles, as the scripture says.
Exactly. And that's where we see this really fascinating contrast with the other verse she brings in Psalm 46.1, where God is described as our refuge.
Okay.
It's like two sides of the same coin. On the one hand, we have this strength to persevere, this hope to move forward, but we're also given this place of safety and shelter when we need it.
It's that balance, isn't it? Knowing when to push forward and when to allow ourselves to rest. And that really resonates, especially when you think about the pressures and expectations that are often placed on Black women. And Bishop Sanders addresses this directly.
She does. And it's such a crucial part of her message. She talks about this tendency to shoulder burdens that aren't theirs to carry. It's almost like an unspoken expectation to be strong, to hold everything together.
To be the strong Black woman.
Exactly.
And it makes me think about that autoimmune specialist she interviewed. The one who talked about the link between stress and physical ailments.
Oh, right.
It's like our bodies cry out when we don't allow ourselves to rest, to rely on a strength beyond our own.
And that's where it becomes more than just a spiritual conversation. It's about our well-being, our physical and emotional health as well. That pressure to be strong can manifest in our bodies in so many ways.
Yeah, it's like that image of the withered plant. Eventually, if we don't address the root cause, if we don't find a source of nourishment, we become depleted. And Bishop Sanders' message is so clear. God doesn't intend for us to carry those burdens alone.
And she makes it so practical, too. It's not just this vague idea. She brings in the names of people from her community.
Yeah.
Real people facing real challenges.
And the prayer session, it brings in such a powerful sense of intimacy to this idea of strength.
Absolutely. You can hear it in her voice the way she prays for Curtis, Carisha, Kelly, Chris. Each name representing a life, a story,
Yeah.
specific need.
Exactly. It reminds us that this isn't some abstract concept. It's about navigating the challenges of everyday life. It's about having the strength to keep going through chemo, or to leave a toxic relationship, the courage to apply for that new job, the energy to be present with your kids after a long day. And within these very specific personal prayers, she also touches on the strength of relationships.
Yes.
Especially marriage. That moment when she talks about the 3-strand cord not being easily broken. She's referencing Ecclesiastes 4.12 there, right?
Yes, exactly. It's like she's suggesting that relying on God's strength not only strengthens us individually, but it strengthens our bonds with others. It's that third strand woven into the relationship.
We'll definitely dive into that more in a bit. But before we do, I think it's worth pausing here and reflecting on the weight of this message. If, as Bishop Sanders says, God is your strength, what narratives about strength might we need to re-examine? What might need to change in our own lives? Let's unpack that a bit further.
It really makes you think, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Because so much of what we often consider strength, that grit, that self-reliance, it can actually be a barrier to really experiencing the fullness of God's strength.
Yeah, it's like we've bought into this idea that the more we can handle on our own, the stronger we are. No wonder so many of us are feeling burned out and exhausted.
Right. It's especially true when we think about what we were just talking about with the pressure on Black women to embody this image of the strong Black woman.
Yeah.
I mean, there's resilience there, absolutely. But at what point does it become a burden? When does it prevent us from actually seeking the support we deserve?
And seeking that support, allowing ourselves to be vulnerable, to not have it all figured out, that becomes an act of courage in itself.
Absolutely. Yeah. Because it requires us to confront those stories we tell ourselves about what it means to be strong.
Right.
And those stories might actually be holding us back from experiencing a deeper strength, the kind of strength that comes from surrendering to something beyond ourselves.
So how do we make that shift then? How do we go from that I've got this mentality to actually letting God be our strength in a real tangible way?
Well, Bishop Sanders offers a really interesting perspective on this. He talks about those moments when we feel like giving up, when we hit that wall and think, I just can't do this anymore.
Ooh, I've been there.
Exactly. And she
Yeah.
reframes those moments not as failures, but as invitations. Invitations to surrender, to acknowledge our limitations, and to open ourselves up to receiving God's strength.
Mhm.
It's in those moments of complete depletion when our own resources have run dry that we can finally truly receive.
I like that word you used, receive. It reminds me of that withered plant we were talking about earlier. The only way that plant can be revived is to be in a position to receive that water. It doesn't have to do anything except exist, to be open to being replenished.
What a powerful connection. And it highlights something so important about surrendering to God's strength. It's not about earning it or proving ourselves worthy. It's about creating space for it,
Yeah.
recognizing that His love and His grace are always there, and our job is to make ourselves receptive.
Which, when you say it out loud, sounds both terrifying and incredibly liberating. Terrifying because it requires a level of trust that I think a lot of us aren't used to. We're so conditioned to believe that our worth is tied to what we do, to how much we can control.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But imagine the freedom that comes with letting go of that need for control. What if we could fully embrace the idea that our worthiness isn't up for debate, that God's love and strength are always available to us, no strings attached?
It makes you wonder what we could accomplish if we weren't constantly running on fumes. If we weren't so busy trying to prove ourselves. What if we took all that energy and poured it into aligning our lives with God's purpose?
That's where true strength lies, I believe. Not in our striving, but in our surrender. And it's not just an individual pursuit. Remember Bishop Sanders' imagery of the three-strand cord, how she relates that to our relationships.
It's like when each strand is anchored to that central point, that unshakable foundation of God's strength. It allows the whole thing to withstand so much more. It can handle storms that would easily break a single strand.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it makes you think about how that applies to marriage or any close relationship, really. When we're each individually rooted in our connection to God, it strengthens the bond between us. We don't put so much pressure on each other to be each other's everything.
Which so often leads to codependency, right? Those unhealthy patterns where we're trying to draw strength from someone who's also running on empty.
Exactly. But when we each have our own wellspring of strength, our own direct connection to the source, it allows us to show up in those relationships from a place of wholeness, not neediness.
It's about offering love and support and encouragement without becoming each other's emotional crutches.
And that kind of mutuality, the shared understanding that our strength comes from God, that can be incredibly powerful for any relationship.
So we've talked about surrendering to God's strength in our personal lives and in our relationships. But what about in those situations where we feel called to be strong for others? Like when a friend is going through something difficult or when we see injustice in the world around us. Does surrender mean becoming passive in those moments?
That's such an important question to ask, because we don't want to confuse surrendering to God's strength with resigning ourselves to difficult situations, do we?
No, absolutely not. There's a big difference between surrender and becoming a doormat. Right? We still have a responsibility to show up for each other, to fight for what we believe in.
Absolutely. And this is where I think Bishop Sanders' message offers a really helpful perspective. Surrendering to God's strength doesn't mean we become passive observers. It's about recognizing that we're not responsible for fixing everything or saving everyone.
We can't pour from an empty cup, right? If we're running on fumes trying to be everything to everyone, we're not going to be effective anywhere, let alone in those situations where others need us the most.
Precisely. When we're rooted in God's strength, we tap into this inexhaustible wellspring of compassion, of love, of resilience.
Yeah.
It allows us to show up for our loved ones, to fight for justice, to persevere through challenges, but we don't become depleted or discouraged ourselves.
So it's not about doing less. It's about approaching those situations from a different place with that groundedness and that inner peace.
Yes, knowing that we're not alone in the struggle, and that sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is simply be present to offer support and love from a place of wholeness. Not from a place of trying to fix or control, but from a place of allowing God to work through us.
So it's about becoming a conduit for God's strength rather than trying to be the source ourselves.
Exactly. And that's an incredibly empowering concept, especially when the world feels so overwhelming and chaotic. It's so easy to get bogged down by the weight of the world's problems, to feel like we have to carry the burden of finding all the solutions.
And that's when that ego can creep in, right? That voice that says, well, if I don't do it, who will? But that's not the voice of God, is it?
Not at all. It's in our weakness that God's strength is made perfect. When we're willing to admit we don't have all the answers, when we're willing to surrender to something greater than ourselves, that's when we create space for Him to work through us in ways we could never imagine.
It's kind of a beautiful paradox, isn't it? That by surrendering control, by acknowledging our limitations, we actually step into a greater experience of strength and power.
It really is.
Yeah.
It requires a real shift in perspective, a willingness to redefine what strength really means. It's not about gritting our teeth and powering through. It's about finding that unshakable peace that comes from knowing we're held, we're loved, and we're never truly alone.
It's about finding those wings to soar, even in the middle of the desert.
Exactly. And that brings us back to Bishop Sanders' message, that powerful reminder that God is under strength, not can be, not might be, but a statement of fact. So if we believe that, if we embrace that on a fundamental level, what needs to change in our own lives? What stories about strength have we been clinging to that might need to be rewritten?
Those are powerful questions. And I think they point us to an even deeper reflection.
Mhm.
What would it look like for us to really step into the fullness of that promise, to live from a place of surrendered strength, not just as a theory, but as a lived reality? It really is like she's challenging us to rethink this whole idea of strength,
Right.
to see it not as this like outward force, something we have to drum up on our own, but as something that flows from within, from a much deeper place.
Yeah.
Yeah.
About connecting to that limitless wellspring, God's love, His grace, His constant unwavering support, and then allowing that to fuel everything we do. Our actions, our decisions, our very presence in the world.
Which, I mean, that's powerful, but it also requires a certain humility, right? To let go of that need to always be in control.
Absolutely. It requires real honesty with ourselves, recognizing that we don't have all the answers. And it invites us to really cultivate a deep, abiding trust that even when we feel most unsure, we're still held by a love that's bigger than anything we can imagine.
Yeah, there's a freedom in that. But I imagine it's not always easy, is it? To silence those voices. The ones that tell us we need to do more, be more, have it all figured out.
Oh, those voices. They can be so loud sometimes. But you've hit on a key point. It is a practice. The more we choose surrender, the more we shift from striving to receiving, the quieter those voices get.
So what does that look like in our everyday lives? How do we actually move through our days rooted in that kind of surrendered strength?
Well, I think Bishop Sanders gives us a beautiful example of it in her prayer session. She doesn't shy away from naming her own needs. You know, those moments when she feels overwhelmed. She's not pretending to be this perfect pastor who has it all together.
Right, she's right there with the people she's praying for.
Exactly. And it makes her message that much more powerful because she's speaking from a place of shared experience, of genuine empathy.
It's like she's saying, hey, I get it. I've been there. And let me tell you, God's strength is real. It's available to you, and it will carry you through.
And not just carry us through, but help us to thrive, even in those desert seasons. Remember that image from Isaiah, soaring on wings like eagles. That's not just getting by, that's something else entirely.
It is. It speaks to a kind of strength that lifts us up, inspires us.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's what Bishop Sanders is inviting us into, to not just survive, but to truly thrive, by tapping into the strength that comes from surrendering to something so much bigger than ourselves.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I keep coming back to that closing thought, that if God truly is our strength, what needs to change?
What stories do we need to rewrite about what it means to be strong?
And how do we start living from that place of surrendered strength, not just as an idea, but as a reality in every area of our lives?
Those are questions worth sitting with, I think, to reflect on, to pray about,
Yeah.
and to allow them to shape how we move forward from here.
Because maybe, just maybe, within those answers lies the key to a level of peace and resilience and joy that we never even thought possible.
And who knows, we might just surprise ourselves along the way.